There was a spark, a loud pop, and then the most glorious shriek I'd ever heard from over the fence. Karen, my entitled neighbor, screaming like her overpriced Gucci sneakers had just caught fire. Technically, it was her son's ATV Charger that combusted, and technically, I didn't do anything illegal. But she had it coming. She earned that moment, spark by spark, lie by lie, plug by stolen plug. You see, you don't siphon power from an electrical engineer without expecting a response. Especially not one who builds fail-safes for military servers and rigs emergency grids for hospitals. Especially not after he warns you, documents the theft, and still gets slapped by the HOA instead of protected. Especially not after she laughed, mimosa in hand, sunglasses gleaming like armor, and said, "It's just a little juice. Lighten up." I did lighten up, her entire backyard, with enough voltage to teach her what boundaries meant. But before you judge, before you imagine I'm just another petty man-child with a grudge and a degree, let me rewind. This isn't just a tale of stolen kilowatts and fried electronics. This is a story about control. About what happens when someone believes the rules don't apply to them. And what happens when the quiet guy next door decides he's had enough. It started with a blip. A subtle anomaly. One that most people wouldn't even notice. But I'm not most people. I monitor my home energy usage the way some people check their stock portfolios. I don't just have solar panels, I have a full-scale microgrid, a custom-built inverter, redundant backups, and a smart monitoring system I coded myself. Electricity is not just a utility to me. It's an extension of my mind, my work, my identity. So when the logs showed a dip during off-peak hours, a drain that didn't correlate with any of my devices, I noticed. It happened between 1 and 3 a.m., precisely. A recurring siphon of about 1.8 kilowatt hours. That's not a toaster or a fridge. That's something industrial or opportunistic. At first, I thought it was a fluke. Maybe a neighbor's equipment was causing a temporary drop through some shared grid noise. Maybe one of my sensors was off. I recalibrated, waited. But the pattern repeated. Exact time frame. Same draw. I ran a diagnostic on all my circuits. No leaks. No faults. I live in a neighborhood where people debate lawn stripes and share kombucha starters, where appearances matter more than substance. People here don't steal. Not overtly. But as I trimmed the hedges that week, I saw it, an orange extension cord snaking over the fence like a lazy python, slithering down behind my tool shed. My tool shed, which didn't even have an outlet installed on that side. I froze. Not out of fear, but disbelief. It wasn't even hidden well. Just coiled loosely, as if whoever did it believed they were immune to consequence. That was the first time I felt something shift inside me. Not rage. Not yet. Just that cold recognition that someone thought I wouldn't notice. That my boundary meant nothing to them. That my silence was compliance. That night, I flipped every exterior breaker except one. A trap, more of a signal test than a snare. And sure enough, the morning logs confirmed it, 2:12 a.m. a dip. Meaning that one live outlet had been used. I had them. Still, I gave the benefit of the doubt. Maybe her son didn't know. Maybe they thought it was a shared utility box. So I went over. Calm. Reasonable. Knocked on Karen's door. She opened it like a lifestyle influencer in a Target ad. Yoga pants, oversized sunglasses, holding a mimosa despite it being 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. I explained the drain. Explained the impact on my system. Gave her a chance to come clean. She smiled. She blinked behind those $300 lenses. And said, "Oh that. We figured it was no biggie. Just a little charge while we waited for the garage panel to get fixed. You've got solar, right? You barely notice it. You barely notice it." I wanted to scream. But I didn't. I've learned that outrage is what people like Karen feed on. Instead, I documented everything. Photos of the cord. Logs of the power usage. I submitted a formal complaint to the HOA. 3 days later, I received a violation notice for creating a hostile neighbor environment and unauthorized modifications to shared property. Karen had flipped the narrative. Claimed I had rigged dangerous traps. Accused me of threatening her family. That was when the shift became permanent. I stopped being the quiet neighbor who played with circuits in his garage. I became something else. I'd been trained to think in systems, to build contingencies. My job wasn't just engineering, it was strategic infrastructure. And Karen had activated every part of me that thrived under constraint and pressure. So I built a plan. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. Out of principle. I created a decoy outlet. One that looked real enough to tempt, but wasn't tied to anything vital. Behind it, a circuit I engineered with loving precision. An impedance trap designed to fry any charger that pulled more than 3 amps. Harmless to humans, to pets, to squirrels, but devastating to an ATV charger. I installed it on my side of the fence. Slightly angled. Like I'd forgotten it existed. I left no warning, no sign. I watched. I waited. And 3 nights later, like clockwork, the orange cord returned. Coiled. Plugged in. At 2:17 a.m., the log spiked. My server lit up. I sipped my tea and watched the feed. And then it happened. A blue flash. A loud pop. And then Karen's scream. Not one of pain. One of violation. Of powerlessness. I smiled. Not because of the damage, but because I'd reclaimed something. My space. My dignity. My right to not be a doormat in a community that let privilege trample boundaries. But I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen don't retreat. They escalate. They conspire. They bend rules and twist narratives until they're the victim. And true to form, the next morning I saw her stomping across her backyard in fuzzy slippers, talking on the phone, gesturing wildly. By midday, the HOA had sent another inspector. Clipboard. Golf shirt. The air of a man who thought he was about to discipline a naughty child. You can't install unauthorized electrical devices on a shared fence, he said without introducing himself. I stood calmly. Let him finish. Let him quote bylaws that didn't apply. I didn't correct him. I didn't argue. I just smiled and offered him a cookie. Because I had only just begun. What Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already started phase 2. A smarter trap. A full surveillance grid. Logs. Notifications. A birdhouse camera, a garden gnome data logger. I wasn't just reacting now. I was anticipating. Because this wasn't about electricity anymore. It was about the ecosystem. About what happens when one parasite starts draining from the whole colony. And I wasn't going to let that happen again. Not without a fight. 3 nights passed in eerie silence. No orange cord. No midnight spike. No Karen. For a moment, I almost let myself believe it was over. That the loud pop and the scorched plastic remains of her son's charger had been enough of a lesson. But people like Karen don't operate on lessons. They operate on perception. Optics. Status. She hadn't stopped because she respected the boundary. I knew she was simply recalculating her next move. And true to form, on the 4th night, I saw it. Not the same orange cord, but a new, heavier black one. Industrial grade. It coiled over the same fence post like a snake that had grown smarter, thicker, and more brazen. This time, she wasn't sneaking. She was escalating. My phone buzzed at 1:42 a.m. The alert from my voltage monitor came in with a tone I'd reserved for emergencies. Power draw detected. 2.7 kilowatt hours and climbing. I was already at my workstation when the second notification hit. Surge threshold exceeded, event triggered. A tiny LED blinked green inside the birdhouse cam. I clicked into the live feed. There it was, a flash, a hiss, a puff of smoke curling skyward like a warning shot into the universe. Her son jumped back again, barefoot this time, shirtless in flannel pajama pants, staring at the charger as if it had betrayed him personally. He yanked the plug, waved away the smoke, and vanished into the dark. I didn't laugh. Not this time. Not because I felt guilty, no, never that, but because I realized something deeper. She wasn't just stealing power. She was testing how far she could push, how deep she could reach into someone else's life before they snapped. This wasn't petty theft. It was psychological warfare, dressed in the silk robe of suburban normalcy. By morning, the cord was gone again. The ATV, once proudly displayed like a trophy, was now covered under a blue tarp weighed down with bricks. An act of shame? Concealment? Or simply staging for her next performance? Either way, I was ready. This time, I wasn't going to wait for HOA letters or phony accusations. This time, I went straight to their office, a stack of printed screenshots in hand, time-stamped, geotagged, annotated like an exhibit in a courtroom. The receptionist blinked as she flipped through the photos. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the footage of the cord snaking over the fence, the clear image of Karen's son crouching to plug it in, the exact kilowatt consumption logged second by second. "She plugged into your outlet?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Twice," I said calmly. "With full documentation. And if you cross-reference your bylaws, Section 8B on unauthorized utility access, you'll see this is a direct violation. Not alleged. Documented." There was a long pause. She chewed her lip, unsure of which script to follow. Karen was close to at least 2 board members. I could see the hesitation creep in. Not disbelief, but inconvenience. This was going to require action. Actual enforcement. "We'll need to conduct a formal review," she finally said. "In the meantime, I recommend removing any exposed outdoor outlets to avoid escalation." "Janice," I replied, leaning in just enough to force her to meet my eyes. "This is an HOA that fined me for having an unpainted mailbox post, but has allowed a neighbor to repeatedly violate private property and lie about it. I've been patient. I've been quiet. But what I have on my server could interest more than just you. I could file a formal theft complaint with the city utility board. Or we can deal with this the neighborly way." She said nothing, but she didn't ask me to leave. That was enough. Later that evening, the front doorbell rang. No HOA rep this time. No formal letter. Just Karen, unfiltered. No sunglasses. No brunch mimosa. Just fury. She launched into accusations, screaming that I had damaged her son's property, that I was endangering her family, that I had set a trap to intentionally harm them. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I just handed her a small USB stick. "What is this?" she snapped. "Everything you need to realize you picked the wrong neighbor," I said, and closed the door. But I knew that moment wouldn't be the end. People like Karen don't retreat with grace. They stage counterattacks. And sure enough, 3 days later, a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. The officer, young, polite, uncomfortable, told me there had been a report filed, alleging that I had created a dangerous electrical hazard on a shared property line. I invited him in, offered him coffee, and sat him down in front of my server terminal. I walked him through the footage, the cords, the timestamps, the logs, the non-lethal surge circuit blueprints, complete with safety thresholds, UL ratings, and human/pet safety parameters. "You're not playing around," he finally said, leaning back in his chair. "No," I said. "But she is. And she's dragging you and your department into it." He nodded. "From what I'm seeing, this looks more like theft of utilities than anything else. I'll file the report accordingly." Karen watched from across the street, iced latte in hand like a prop, her sunglasses back on, her posture frozen as the cruiser pulled out of my driveway. This time, she didn't shout. She didn't stomp. She just stared, calculating. But it wasn't my fear she was measuring. It was her own diminishing control. The next morning, a letter arrived from the HOA. Gold embossed seal. Legalistic tone. $500 fine for unauthorized electrical installations, and a mandatory inspection scheduled within 10 business days. So I responded in kind, with a dossier. Photos, logs, videos, blueprints. I CC'd the city utility board and the building inspector. I attached a formal complaint citing multiple violations of electrical code, property encroachment, and evidence of systematic unauthorized access to multiple residences. And then something unexpected happened. Neighbors started approaching me. Tom from 2 doors down, the guy with the outdoor pizza oven, asked if I'd noticed power dips around 2 a.m. Nancy, who never said more than a polite wave, said her garden lights had been flickering for weeks. The Patels, who ran a home catering business, told me they'd lost a week's worth of frozen prep food because their garage freezer had randomly shut off at 2:13 a.m. on a Saturday. That was when I knew. This wasn't just about me. Karen hadn't been feeding off one outlet. She'd been quietly stealing power from half the neighborhood, conducting her own illicit grid like some petty suburban emperor. We started a group chat. At first, just a few of us. Then more joined. Shocked by Karen, we called it half as a joke, half as a war room. Within hours, we were over 20 strong. People shared photos, shared logs, shared suspicions they'd never dared voice. She'd tapped RV ports, garden sockets, unlocked patio outlets. We got organized. I helped Tom install a power monitor. Nancy gave me access to her side yard to plant another decoy cord. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back our power, literally and figuratively. Karen didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just up against me now. She was up against a network, a microgrid of neighbors who'd finally had enough. And we were just getting started. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the last Thursday of the month, a recurring event usually so dull it could lull a hummingbird into a coma. Most of the time, it was a parade of flowerbed disputes, patio paint code violations, and passive-aggressive complaints about hedge heights. But not this time. This time, people arrived early. The parking lot overflowed. Neighbors who hadn't been to a meeting in years showed up with folders, USB sticks, and printouts in hand. I recognized nearly every face from the group chat. Tom, Nancy, the Patels, even Mr. Collins from the end of the cul-de-sac who hadn't spoken to anyone in over a year. Everyone had a story. Everyone had something to say. Karen was already there when I walked in, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, lips tight, and jaw clenched like a pit bull guarding a shrinking bone. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't need to. Her posture screamed defiance, like she still believed she could outmaneuver the truth through sheer willpower. The HOA board sat at their table, 5 members, 2 of whom I knew had always been close to Karen. Greg, the president, wore the strained expression of someone who knew a storm was coming and still hoped to ride it out with polite civility. It wouldn't be enough. Not tonight. The meeting opened with standard procedure, minutes from last session, an update on landscaping contracts, the usual administrative fluff. But then Greg called for community concerns, and that's when it all shifted. Tom stood first, stepping up with a USB drive and plugging it into the projector. "I'd like to present evidence of repeated, unauthorized power use originating from my outdoor outlets," he said flatly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The data did all the shouting. Graphs, timestamps, motion capture stills, voltage logs. Then Nancy followed. Her garden light flicker logs, camera footage of Karen's son lurking near her trellis with a coil of extension cord in his hand, a quick plug-and-run maneuver caught on infrared. Then the Patels. Footage of their back gate opening in the dead of night. A hidden cord leading to their commercial freezer. And finally, I stepped up. I laid it all out, not just my footage, but the forensic map I'd created. An overlay of energy drains across the block. Dates, times, draw amounts, surge signatures. When cross-referenced, they formed a pattern, a clear indication of repeated, deliberate theft. Karen tried to interrupt, tried to downplay it. "These people are exaggerating," she spat. "This is harassment. You're all just jealous and paranoid." But it was too late. The data had already dismantled her narrative. The breaking point came when one neighbor, a quiet woman named Denise, who had barely spoken until now, produced her utility bills for the past year. They showed a clear spike in energy usage beginning the same month Karen's ATV had first appeared. Another neighbor pulled breaker logs showing unexplained resets. All signs pointed to one thing. Karen had been orchestrating a sprawling, decentralized theft operation right under everyone's noses. Greg looked like someone had dropped a bowling ball into his stomach. He shifted uncomfortably. "We'll need to launch an official investigation," he mumbled. But it wasn't enough. The room buzzed with energy, not from anger anymore, but momentum. People weren't asking for an investigation. They were demanding consequences. The board voted to suspend Karen's HOA privileges pending the investigation. Her access to the community pool, clubhouse, and shared resources was revoked. Fines were discussed. Legal liability raised. Someone even mentioned a restraining order. Karen stood abruptly, knocking over her chair, and stormed out, muttering under her breath. No one followed. But that wasn't the end. In fact, it was only the beginning. Because what we had discovered went beyond a few stolen kilowatts. It exposed a pattern, a mentality, that had gone unchecked for years. Karen had operated under the assumption that politeness would keep people silent. That her manipulation would always be protected by plausible deniability. That her status shielded her from accountability. That illusion had just been shattered. In the days that followed, the neighborhood changed. People waved at each other more. Conversations happened over fences. The group chat didn't just serve as a support network anymore. It became a place where we shared tools, coordinated upgrades, checked in on elderly neighbors. The block began to feel like a community again. Karen, on the other hand, retreated into her house. The ATV vanished. Rumor was it had been sold to help pay the rising tide of fines and legal bills. The karaoke machine was silent. The backyard, once a nightclub powered by parasitic cords, now looked abandoned. And in its place, something peculiar appeared: garden gnomes. Dozens of them, scattered across her yard like tiny, smiling sentinels. A rebrand? An apology? Or just another layer of performative weirdness meant to distract from the wreckage she'd created? Her son, once the self-appointed prince of the cul-de-sac, was now seen pulling weeds and mowing lawns. The ATV rebellion had ended. In its place, silence. Even he seemed to understand now that consequences were real, that actions taken in the shadows will eventually be dragged into the light. But we weren't done. Not yet. Because the utility company had taken notice. After forwarding my technical report, I'd received a formal reply. An auditor had reviewed my evidence and determined that what had occurred could constitute third-party utility fraud under city code. An investigation was opened. Karen was served a letter requesting a home inspection. She ignored it. A second notice followed. Then a subpoena. The city was no longer treating this as a neighborhood squabble. This was theft. Measurable, documented, deliberate. And that meant legal consequences. In parallel, one of the affected neighbors hired a private attorney to draft a civil claim for damages. The strategy was simple. Use the evidence we had, collective footage, power logs, testimonies, to pursue Karen for restitution. Karen, predictably, painted herself as a victim. She claimed surveillance, harassment, mob rule. During a particularly loud phone call outside her house, she compared our collective action to fascism. But this wasn't fascism. It was infrastructure justice. It was what happens when people who've been disrespected for too long decide to organize instead of apologize. The city investigation culminated in a 60-page report detailing over 3,000 kilowatt-hours of unmetered usage traced back to Karen's household over a 4-month period. The cost, including penalties, exceeded $1,800. Combined with HOA fines and legal fees, she faced a financial wrecking ball. Yet through it all, she never apologized. Not publicly. Not personally. She clung to denial like it was the last buoy in a storm she created. And the neighborhood, once unwilling to confront her, now refused to engage. She became a ghost behind tinted windows. The HOA, perhaps finally recognizing its own complicity, held emergency elections. 3 board members stepped down. A former firefighter named Gwen was elected as the new president, and within weeks she rewrote the charter to include explicit clauses about utility theft, random inspections, and stricter enforcement. I was asked to join the new Safety and Infrastructure Subcommittee. I declined the spotlight, but agreed to advise. I helped several neighbors install tamper-proof outlets, configured monitoring systems, and for the first time in years, felt like my skills were building something that actually mattered, not just for uptime metrics, but for people. Karen had underestimated us. She thought she could manipulate rules the same way she manipulated perception. But what she never anticipated was what happens when quiet neighbors start documenting everything. When they collaborate. When they build a smarter grid, not of wires, but of resolve. We didn't just take back our electricity. We took back our trust. Our peace. And the next time Karen tried to steal that, she'd find something waiting on the other side of the fence. Not just a surge circuit, but a neighborhood that finally knows how to say no. It was almost poetic, the silence that settled over the neighborhood after the storm. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty but earned, the kind that followed a battle. Not one of blood or bullets, but of documents, surveillance, voltage, and quiet defiance. Karen, once the loudest force in a 2-block radius, had retreated into the shadows of her own making. But we knew better than to assume her surrender was permanent. People like Karen didn't just vanish. They waited. They recalculated. And sure enough, the final phase began not with a bang, but with a flinch, a new letter from the city, this time marked with urgency. Karen had failed to comply with the mandatory inspection, and under municipal code, her non-response triggered an escalation. A subpoena had been issued. Her property would now be subject to official investigation by the city's Utility Enforcement Division. The day of the inspection was unseasonably bright. 2 inspectors arrived mid-morning in a marked city vehicle, wearing polos with the seal of the Municipal Energy Oversight Committee. They weren't there to ask politely. They were there to audit. The irony didn't escape anyone. Karen had weaponized her influence for years, manipulated meetings, bent rules, and for a while, even twisted HOA policy around her fingers like spaghetti. But now, the same system she thought she could outmaneuver had come to her doorstep, armed not with gossip or neighborhood drama, but state-backed authority and meter readers calibrated to microns. I stayed back, of course, but I didn't need to be there. The footage from my driveway cam showed enough. The inspectors entered her home after a brief argument at the door. Her son hovered nearby, arms crossed, visibly uncomfortable. When the team emerged an hour later, they looked grim and quietly professional, the kind of demeanor city officials adopt when they've confirmed something bad enough to put in a report. One of them stopped at my house before they left. "I just wanted to let you know," he said, flipping through his notes, "that your documentation provided the initial flags we needed. What we found confirms a sustained period of unauthorized external draws routed through disguised extension lines and improperly spliced outdoor junctions. One of her irrigation control panels was rerouted to function as a disguised junction box." I blinked. She'd rewired an irrigation timer to steal power. That wasn't just petty theft. That was calculated, technical, and reckless. "What's the next step?" I asked. "Her total backdraw is currently estimated at just over 3,000 kilowatt hours," he said. "The fine structure under Municipal Code 4.3.7 is progressive. At that level, she's eligible for both civil penalties and a potential criminal citation. We'll file the full report by the end of the week." I thanked him, not because I was glad it had come to this, but because it finally meant the burden was no longer just ours. No longer a whisper campaign among neighbors. It was fact, record, law. The next few days were tense but productive. I helped Gwen, our new HOA president, draft the final revision of the charter that would be voted on at the next emergency session. We included stricter protections against utility encroachment, enforced minimum standards for outlet security, and clauses that would allow for immediate suspension of privileges for repeat violations. For the first time, our HOA felt like it wasn't just a garden club with fines. It felt like a body that could actually protect the people funding it. Karen, meanwhile, tried something unexpected. She held a yard sale. Except it wasn't really a yard sale. It was a liquidation. Her karaoke machine gone. The industrial-grade speaker system, boxed and tagged. Even the light fixtures that had once framed her nightly dance parties were disassembled and stacked neatly near the driveway. People came. Bargain hunters. Strangers from other neighborhoods. But none of us attended. Not one neighbor. We watched silently from porches, blinds, behind garden trellises. Karen was dismantling her empire in plain view, and yet it was clear she hadn't fully accepted her downfall. I remember one afternoon, I saw her in her backyard, hosing down the patio as if prepping for another party. The patio furniture was gone, the string lights were packed, and yet she moved with a strange kind of delusional poise, like if she acted normal enough, she could rewind time. Her son no longer roamed the neighborhood. I saw him once, pulling weeds near the curb, earbuds in, gaze fixed downward like he wanted to disappear. Whether it was punishment or an attempt at humility, no one asked. But his silence spoke louder than any defense his mother had tried. Then came the final blow. An official certified letter was delivered to her door and posted to her mailbox. The city had finalized its review. Karen owed $1,812 in restitution for stolen utilities. That did not include HOA fines, which now totaled nearly $2,000, or legal fees that had been passed on to her from the community complaint process. The letter outlined the full scope of her actions: unauthorized connections, tampering with control panels, illegal rerouting of property infrastructure. But what struck me most wasn't the numbers or the citations, it was the language. Deliberate and sustained misappropriation of electrical infrastructure in a residential grid. It read. Behavior indicative of intent, not ignorance. And just like that, the narrative she had built, of innocence, misunderstanding, persecution, collapsed. The city had said, in black and white, "You did this. On purpose." I thought that might be the end. But instead, something strange happened. The neighborhood didn't celebrate. No one gloated. No one knocked on her door to say, "I told you so." The energy that once fueled our outrage had been replaced with a quiet maturity. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were rebuilding. I helped Nancy install solar-powered security lights. I showed Tom how to monitor his energy use with a low-cost Raspberry Pi setup I'd developed. The Patels asked me to help them design a backup battery system for their food storage. We weren't just protecting against Karen. We were evolving past her. But she didn't understand that. Not yet. One afternoon, when I was working in my driveway adjusting the tilt on my panels, she walked up to the edge of my property line. She wasn't carrying anything. No sunglasses. No Starbucks. Just her. She looked smaller somehow. Like the air around her had stopped cooperating. I just wanted to say, "Well, I guess I owe you an apology," she said, her voice uneven, like the words were sharp in her mouth. I stood still. Let the silence stretch. For which part? I asked, without malice, but without softness either. She blinked. All of it, she mumbled. I didn't think it would. I didn't realize how serious. It's never harmless when you take something that isn't yours, I replied. Especially when it's not just once. She nodded, then turned, walking slowly back to her house, her posture no longer stiff, just tired. I didn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I believed in the power of consequences. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to as well. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the lights flicker on across the neighborhood, each one powered by the people who paid for them, maintained them, respected them. The air was cool, the sky deep orange with hints of pink. And for the first time in months, I didn't check my phone for voltage spikes. Because peace, I had learned, doesn't happen by accident. You have to wire it, monitor it, and sometimes defend it. And once you do, you never plug into someone else's again. Spring arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as if even the seasons were holding their breath after the months of quiet warfare our neighborhood had endured. But with the arrival of the sun came something more profound, a collective sense that the power struggle, in every sense of the word, had come to an end. Not the dramatic, explosive end that Karen might have feared or that some neighbors had fantasized about, but something more final, more permanent, because it wasn't her belongings that were taken or her home that was lost. It was her illusion of untouchability, and once shattered, that never really heals. A few days after her non-apology, the HOA posted a new notice to all homes in the subdivision. Karen's voting privileges were revoked indefinitely. Her access to community facilities remained suspended pending payment of outstanding fines, and a new clause was ratified into our updated charter. Any resident found guilty of property encroachment or utility theft would be subject to not only financial penalties, but formal community censure. The term sounded dramatic, but its effect was simple and profound. The community now had a structured way to say no. No to manipulation. No to loophole abusers. No to the Karens of the world. I didn't celebrate. There was no toast, no fireworks, no declaration. But I noticed that I checked my home's monitoring systems less and less. The data streams were clean. No unexplained dips, no phantom surges, no blinking logs. I even went a full week without opening the dashboard. That silence in the numbers was louder than any argument I could have won. One morning, I found myself walking past Karen's house on a coffee run. I didn't plan it, it was just on the way. The gnomes were still there, standing awkwardly in small clusters like embarrassed party guests who hadn't realized the host had left. The front yard was maintained, but not manicured like it used to be. Gone were the weekly visits from her overpriced landscaping service. Gone were the Friday night light shows and the dance music. The house felt like it had shrunk, not in size, but in presence. Her son was outside, cleaning out the garage. He didn't look up when I passed, but there was no hostility in his posture. Just tiredness. I almost pitied him, not because of what had happened, but because of what it must have been like to grow up thinking rules only applied to other people and then being forced to learn the truth all at once. A week later, a moving truck appeared. Small, understated, no big logo or company name, just a beige box on wheels. I saw Karen directing the movers from the porch. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't wearing designer sunglasses or drinking out of a monogrammed tumbler. She looked normal. That was the real defeat. Not the fines or the legal bills, but the stripping away of the persona she had cloaked herself in for years. Without it, she was just a woman standing on a porch, watching her curated empire disappear one box at a time. By sundown, she was gone. Just like that. No odbis. No confrontation. No final tantrum. The house sat empty for a while, and then a for sale sign appeared with a small, impersonal placard beneath it. By appointment only. No open houses. No glossy brochures. She didn't want anyone walking through her failure. Not yet. Not while the ground was still warm. The neighborhood didn't erupt in celebration. There were no parties or welcome parades. But there was relief. A visible, tangible relaxation in the way people talked, waved, walked their dogs. It was like a collective exhale after years of shallow breathing. We hadn't just lost a neighbor, we'd survived a slow, parasitic erosion of trust and finally rebuilt it, fiber by fiber. At the next HOA meeting, Gwen, the new president, shared a detailed energy audit across the block. Since Karen's departure, our neighborhood's average nighttime energy stability had improved by 18%. Breaker trips were down, power anomalies had vanished, and more importantly, reported tensions between residents had dropped to near zero. People didn't just get their power back, they got their peace. I continued to advise on the infrastructure committee, though I still refused a permanent position. I didn't want power, not the political kind. I wanted resilience, systems that didn't depend on luck or goodwill alone. I started consulting privately, helping other neighborhoods develop their own monitoring networks, teaching them how to use technology, not just to surveil but to protect, to empower. Funny how it started with a single extension cord. One tiny act of disrespect, pulling more than just electricity, pulling dignity, safety, silence. But in the end, we pulled back. We reclaimed. We didn't scream or riot or lash out. We documented. We organized. We resisted strategically. That became the real lesson, the true current running beneath everything. Not the volts or amps, but the principle, boundaries matter. And when people cross them repeatedly, unapologetically, it becomes everyone's problem. The new owners of Karen's house moved in quietly. A young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. They replaced the gnomes with potted succulents and solar lights. The backyard was cleared, reseeded, leveled. The garage no longer glowed at odd hours. The toddler rode a tricycle up and down the driveway, ringing the bell on his handlebars like it was a war cry of joy. Sometimes, when I heard the cheerful sound of his laughter bouncing through the cul-de-sac, I'd smile, not because I felt victorious, but because it felt possible to believe again. Possible to trust again. One evening, Gwen stopped by with a bottle of wine and a question. She asked if I ever regretted it. All the work, the documentation, the long nights building traps, defending my outlet, standing up against someone everyone else had tiptoed around for years. I thought for a moment, letting the quiet fill the porch. Then I said no. Not because it was easy. Not because I enjoyed it. But because the alternative, doing nothing, staying silent, was no longer something I could live with. There's a kind of peace that doesn't come from avoiding conflict, but from confronting it properly, methodically, with purpose. That's the kind of peace we live with now. And every time the streetlights come on, powered cleanly and honestly, I know it was worth it. As the sun dipped below the rooftops and the solar grid handed off to the batteries, I sat back in my chair and listened to the quiet hum of energy flowing exactly where it was supposed to, accounted for, respected, earned.